All right, so this next student question is on, sorry about that. This next student question is on racism in education. And one of the things I kind of want to preface before I start this answer is that very much racism and classism in education go hand in hand. You'll see what I mean in a second. So public school system as we know it in the United States comes out of the state of Massachusetts in the 1830s with Horace Mann, an educational reformer who believed that the government should fund a system of public schools, which is great. But then the question becomes who's going to go to these schools, because at the time, children who were middle or upper class, great, although upper class folks had access to private education already. But for kids who belonged to poor families, they were more likely to have to go to work because we don't have child labor laws yet or minimum wage to support their families. And so there's always this issue of who gets access to education that's based on class, but also very heavily on race. Now, there's no system of public education outside of the North and West until Reconstruction. The South rejects the public education movement before the Civil War because, again, the elites can afford to send their kids to private schools, and they really don't want to have to pay money to send other people's kids to school. And in fact, at this time, for African Americans who were enslaved, they were actually forbidden by law from learning to read or write in many states. So the South doesn't get public schools until after Reconstruction, or excuse me, during Reconstruction, when the South finally gets on the public school bandwagon. After the failure of Reconstruction, this is where we start to see segregation become more common in schools along racial lines. And the question is of legality of this in the southern and western states that are doing this. And in 1896, the Supreme Court hears the case Plessy v. Ferguson that says that segregation is totally okay so long as these separate facilities are equal. The problem is that they are almost never equal. During one period in the late 1800s, there were no public high schools for African Americans in certain southern states, even though there were high schools for white kids. That's a flagrant violation of that principle. Poet Maya Angelou talked about her childhood in one of these segregated schools, and she said that basically they got everything that was rejected as too worn or unfit for the white schools came to their school. They never got new books. And because of those decades of very stark evidence that separate but equal was not a thing, the Supreme Court in 1954 in Brown v. Board of Education says, okay, yeah, no, segregation's not working. There is no separate and equal. So that is a sea change in education. However, the impact of Brown v. Board is very much limited by the fact that our public schools are attendance is zoned based on where you live, and we still have very high levels of residential segregation. So that means if you're living in a majority neighborhood, then that's what your school is going to look like. You're not going to be very integrated. And then you also have school funding is zoned based on property taxes. So if you live in a wealthier school district, wealthier people live there, they're going to pay more money, you're going to have more funding. So what ends up happening in the United States is schools today are actually more segregated than they were in the 1970s because of these two issues, because of the continuing levels of residential segregation. And we also see this very big inequity in funding between, for example, inner city districts that are more heavily students of color versus suburban or more white-leaning districts that are wealthier, they get more money. And the Supreme Court has heard cases about this before in the 1970s. For example, some school districts took to busing to try to mix up kids to get around that residential zoning issue. The Supreme Court said you can do that, but it's voluntary. So again, we don't see that as very popular anymore. The Supreme Court actually heard a case out of San Antonio on education funding, and they said, look, there's really nothing that we can do about this. The system sucks, but there's nothing precluding it in the Constitution. So that's why race and class are very heavily related in schools, because for the most part, residential segregation is effectively class first and then oftentimes race second. We also see in today's schools, because of that, we see students of color targeted more heavily for retribution, for harsher punishments like expulsion from schools for more minor things. This is where we talk about the pre-K to prison pipeline, unfortunately, this system of harsher punishment and kind of students getting labeled early on as problematic or troublemakers. We see this disproportionately for boys of color, but also increasingly for girls. And these are not really easy fixes, because the United States historically with public schools since the 1830s has been so wed to zoning based on where you live and funding based on property taxes of where you live. Until we really rethink the system, it's going to be difficult to really make lasting change.